So, hello. This is the introduction to the first part out of 3 in a lecture trilogy, or 3-part series where I will be going through everything there is to know about the goddess Idunn in our sources. And it will incidentally be a lot about those sources too, because they are interesting. Now, if you look up Idunn in some textbook or online, Google it, you might find that she is described either as a goddess of youth or as a goddess of fertility. I have been trying to find out why she is described this way, since I could not actually find anything in the sources that actually do prove that she was either a goddess of youth or a goddess of fertility. And the only reasoning I could find were these very simple words in Rudolf Siemek's Dictionary of Modern Mythology. It's this one. Now, this book is a treasure in so many ways, not the least because it gives you an overview over which sources one may look up to find something about a certain mythical character, and also because it gives you an overview of many of the different approaches and the different understandings that are at large today, and also where there is consensus between scholars. But I have to say I was disappointed when I looked up this otherwise wonderful book and looked up Idunn, and the conclusion actually reads, let me see, if Idunn was indeed venerated as a goddess in pagan times, she would belong to the fertility goddesses because of her apples. There you go. Because of her apples. It's that simple. Like with the Adam and Eve story in the Bible, you know, it's all about fertility too, isn't it? I mean, because of the apples. I mean, that story involves apples too. So the Bible story must need be about a fertility cult, and Adam and Eve must of course be fertility idols, right? Well, that's the logic here. So I'm going so into this. Idunn is the goddess who is most famous for being abducted. But she does hide, as we shall see, so many deeper aspects once we dive into her myth. And yes, I said myth in singular, because for all we know, there is only one myth in which Idunn clearly plays a central role, and that is the one where she is abducted and later rescued, as told in a 9th century Skaldic poem called Haustlöng and elaborated by Snorri Sturluson in the Skaldskaparmál. Now, I made a live lecture in Norway back in 2018 about this subject, and it was before a crowd of modern actual heathens at Idunn during an event in which Idunn was the focal point of that day's ritual. And after speaking, I was invited to attend my first actual blot, as practiced by some modern heathens in Norway. And I had, of course, mentioned the Edda poem Fornspjalsljod, or Odin's Ravengaldr, but only because Idunn is mentioned, described with several poetical metaphors in stanza 6. Something I will get back to in this lecture series. The point here is that during this ritual that I had the fortune to be a part of, a reenactment of this mysterious Edda poem, the Hrafnagaldr, was played out, showing Idunn as the main female character of this poem, and showing that this mysterious Edda poem was another way of telling the same story, a story of the loss of the goddess. And that was quite a revelation to me, that there is indeed yet another literary source about the myth, about Idunn, where I thought we had to contend ourselves with 2 sources. So of course I delved into it, and I will dedicate the 3rd and last part of this lecture series to the Hrafnagaldr Oðins, Odin's raven charm. So when I began to work on this lecture about Idunn, it soon became apparent that it would be grand. Too long for just one lecture. Too long for 2 lectures. So I have had to split the whole thing in 3. And this allows me to go deeper into each part without losing your interest on the way due to too much and too long. There are 3 main written sources about the goddess. The oldest is the Haustlöng, a skaldic poem, composed in the form that we know it as early as the late 9th centuries. That would be the late 800s. This takes us back to deep Viking Age pagan times. And the poem is, like all skaldic poems, crammed with metaphors called kenningar and heiti, all alluding to matters that the poet back in his day could assume that everybody knew. Sadly, we today do not have the same cultural references, and it is the absolute truth that the poem simply cannot be understood by moderns unless we gain access to that cultural reference. So we find that reference in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, where he explains the metaphors of skaldic poetry by telling us the whole prose story background. He tells us the background, explains why these different metaphors are being used. And since this prose version is completely necessary to know well before delving into the older skaldic source, I will begin with the Skaldskaparmál version of the story, the Prose Edda version. And we need to know this prose version first in order to make sense of the poetic versions that we are going to discuss later. I decided to call the whole series Idunn in Poetry and Myth, Skaldskaparmál, Haustlöng, and Hrafnagaldr Oðins. The first part, this part, is Idunn Part 1, Skaldskaparmál. The second part will be Idunn Part 2, Haustlöng, a skaldic poem of the Viking Age. And the final chapter will be Idunn Part 3, Hrafnagaldr Oðins, where I will discuss the mysterious source that is the Hrafnagaldr. In the first part, I will be introducing you to these 3 main written sources and talk about some archaeological sources that might shed some light on the goddess. And then I will delve in deep into the most well-known version of the story, Skaldskaparmál. And I will be talking about Snorri's purpose when he wrote his works about Norse myths. Because I keep seeing Snorri getting dismissed in arrogant and ignorant ways. And I tend to make it more than clear that what we owe to him, and how it is possible to see the worth, how we must see the worth of what he did for us, and what he made possible for us, even as we must apply discernment with his works, just as we must with any other source. Source criticism is necessary, but does not mean the same as source dismissal. It just means that we cannot look up any historical source without studying the context in which it was created, or without comparing it to other sources in order to check out if it could be authentic information about what we are searching for, which in this case is pagan religious traditions. I will of course also discuss all the information we do get in the Skaldskaparmál, preparing us for the next chapter, the one where I will be discussing the Haustlöng version. In the second part, I will introduce you to the basics of skaldic poetry and then go through the entire poem of the Haustlöng in both Norse and English translation. And Haustlöng is a skaldic poem, so we will be delving deep into the world of poetical metaphors and what they might tell us about the Idunn myth. I will end up discussing what these 2 sources together, the skaldic poem and the prose version, may tell us about pagan ritual practices such as seider and blot, and what the whole myth may really be about. In the third part, I will introduce you to a mysterious Edda poem called the Hrafnagaldr Oðins. It means Odin's raven charm. And I will go through the entire poem in its original with translations and analysis, and discuss whether or not it makes sense to see this poem as another version of the Idunn myth. This lecture series has taken a lot of work, so this lecture series will be published for my patrons at my Patreon account only. It does not have to cost you more than a cup of coffee, or 2 cups, depending on where you live. But supporting me, if you support me on Patreon, you will get access to lectures such as these and other exclusive content, and you will help me be able to keep producing lectures like these and more. Thank you.
Skal kenna Iðunn i, så att kalla hana konebraga och gätan de äpplarna en äpplin elliliv åsarna. Snoter, meidas kunni elliliv åsa, brunnakers bäckjar dis, mära möj stäran de munhapta, ölgeffen, ölgefjon, åsa leika, dis forvitin, frå Yggdrasils, Ivaldis eldri, yngsta barni, alfa ettar, nanna syrgjandi, jallar sunnu gott, veiga selja, Jorun, svanna. Hon och kronfänger tjasa Götuns, så som Führer sagt, att han tog hana braut från Åsum. Efter deiri sägu, orti tjodal för en kvinverski i Haustlöng. Åsa svår rätt att kenna, att kalla ein var en annars nafni, och kenna vid verk sin, eda eigen, eda etter.